The Boeing 737 shuddered through turbulence at 37,000 feet, its passengers lost in the hypnotic drone of pressurized flight. In row 6, seat C, Lieutenant Commander Valentina Ghost Restrepo slept with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to find rest in the belly of an FA-18 Super Hornet. Her naval aviator wings, barely visible beneath her civilian jacket, caught fragments of overhead lighting as the aircraft bucked against invisible air currents. Captain Michael Torres felt the yoke fight back against his grip, hydraulic fluid pressure dropping faster than his training manuals had ever described. The 737's primary flight computer flickered between normal operations and cascade failure warnings that made his throat tighten. Beside him, First Officer Janet Kim worked through emergency checklists with mechanical precision, but both pilots knew they were approaching the edge of their operational envelope. United 1247, Denver Center, were showing irregularities in your telemetry. Confirm aircraft status, crackled through their headsets. Torres keyed his mic. Denver Center, United 1247, we're experiencing multiple hydraulic system anomalies, requesting vectors to nearest suitable airport. His voice carried the controlled tension of a man watching his worst-case scenarios unfold in real time. The aircraft's nose dipped unexpectedly, sending coffee cups and magazines tumbling through the cabin. Passengers stirred from their travel stupor, that primal aviation anxiety beginning to ripple through the enclosed space. Flight attendant Maria Santos moved with practiced calm, but her eyes betrayed the growing concern as she noticed the captain's frequent glances toward the passenger manifest. In the cockpit, Torres made a decision that would either save 218 lives or become another statistic in aviation disaster databases. He unbuckled his harness and stepped into the cabin, his captain's uniform immediately drawing attention from passengers who weren't sure if they should feel reassured or terrified. "Ladies and gentlemen," Torres announced, his voice cutting through the ambient noise, "this is your captain. I need to know if there are any military pilots aboard this aircraft. Please identify yourselves immediately." The cabin fell into that peculiar silence that precedes either relief or catastrophe. Passengers exchanged glances, some pulling out phones despite federal regulations, others gripping armrests with white-knuckled intensity. Somewhere in the back, a child began crying. Ghost's eyes opened. She had been dreaming of carrier landings, that violent ballet of controlled crashes onto moving flight decks, where split-second decisions separated successful traps from becoming aluminum confetti scattered across unforgiving ocean surfaces. The dream dissolved as she processed the captain's words, her mind immediately cataloging the aircraft's subtle vibrations, the slight off-angle of their flight path, the barely perceptible changes in engine harmonics that most passengers would never notice. Ghost unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her movement fluid despite the aircraft's unstable flight characteristics. Around her, passengers turned to stare at this unremarkable woman in jeans and a faded navy t-shirt, someone they had barely noticed during boarding. She raised her hand. "Lieutenant Commander Valentina Restrepo, Naval Air Station Oceana," she said, her voice carrying across the cabin with unmistakable authority. "What's your situation, Captain?" Torres felt something shift in his chest, not relief exactly, but the first glimpse of a solution that didn't end in twisted metal and aviation fuel fires. He had requested military pilots plural, hopping for someone with commercial aviation experience. Instead, he had found something potentially more valuable, a naval aviator trained to land on moving aircraft carriers in conditions that would ground most civilian pilots. The passenger in 12A, a retired airline mechanic named Robert Chen, watched this exchange with growing fascination. He had spent 40 years around airports and could read aircraft behavior like others read facial expressions. This 737 was flying wrong, its control surfaces making micro-adjustments that suggested significant system degradation. But something about the Navy pilot's posture, the way she assessed their situation with cold professional calculation, made him think they might have found their miracle. Ghost moved forward through the cabin, her trained eyes noting the aircraft's flight characteristics, the subtle cues that painted a picture of escalating mechanical failure. Passengers stepped aside, some instinctively recognizing competence even when it arrived in an unexpected package. As she approached the cockpit, she caught fragments of radio communication between TORS and air traffic control. United 1247, be advised, weather conditions at Denver International showing severe wind shear. Recommend alternate airports for emergency approach. TORS looked back at Ghost as she reached the flight deck. Commander, I don't know what you flew in the Navy, but right now I need someone who understands aircraft systems and isn't afraid of unconventional approaches. We've lost most of our hydraulic pressure, and our flight computers are giving us conflicting information about control surface response. Ghost slipped into the cockpit, her eyes immediately scanning the instrument panel with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to absorb critical information under pressure. The hydraulic system indicators painted a grim picture, multiple failures cascading through backup systems faster than normal emergency procedures could address. She keyed the intercom. Captain, with your permission, I'd like to assess our actual control authority before we commit to any specific approach. In the Navy, we call this testing the boundaries of your flight envelope without exceeding them. What she didn't say was that her call sign, Ghost, had nothing to do with stealth capabilities or mysterious flying techniques. It came from her ability to bring damaged aircraft home when everyone else assumed they were already dead. The 737 continued its unstable flight path toward an uncertain outcome, carrying 218 souls who had no idea their lives now depended on a woman who had learned to fly in conditions most pilots only experienced in nightmares. Outside the aircraft windows, the Colorado landscape spread below them like a detailed map of potential crash sites, each field and highway representing either salvation or catastrophe, depending on decisions made in the next crucial minutes. Ghost placed her hands on the secondary controls, feeling the aircraft's mechanical heartbeat through the yoke. Somewhere below them, emergency vehicles were already moving toward runways, their crews preparing for outcomes nobody wanted to discuss aloud. The real test was about to begin. TORS relinquished partial control to Ghost, watching as she tested their remaining flight authority with movements so subtle they barely registered on the control surfaces. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had learned to coax performance from damaged aircraft, reading feedback through fingertips that had been trained to interpret mechanical responses most pilots never learned to recognize. "We've got maybe 60% control authority," Ghost murmured, more to herself than TORS. "Enough to make controlled inputs, but we're going to need to think unconventionally about energy management and approach angles." Through her headset, she listened to air traffic control coordinating emergency services, their voices maintaining professional calm while discussing scenarios that made her stomach tight. She had brought damaged FA-18s back to carrier decks in weather that grounded most aircraft, but those landings involved aircraft designed for violent controlled crashes. This Boeing 737 had been built for gentle touchdowns on long, stable runways. First Officer Kim turned toward Ghost, her expression mixing hope with skepticism. "Commander, no disrespect, but naval aviation and commercial flight operations are completely different environments. Carrier approaches involve controlled crashes onto moving targets. This aircraft has 200 passengers who expect to walk away from our landing." Ghost met Kim's eyes with a look that carried the weight of multiple combat deployments and emergency landings most pilots only read about in incident reports. "Ma'am, I've never lost a passenger. Not in combat, not in training, not in emergencies that made this look like a practice session. But I need both of you to trust my recommendations, even when they sound unconventional. The aircraft shuddered again, this time more violently, as another hydraulic system component failed. Emergency checklists scattered across the cockpit floor, their standard procedures increasingly irrelevant to their actual situation. Ghost's fingers found the trim controls, making microscopic adjustments that stabilized their flight path without relying on primary hydraulic systems. Behind them, Flight Attendant Santos moved through the cabin, her trained smile masking growing concern as she noticed passengers pointing toward the engines, where subtle vibrations suggested mechanical issues beyond normal operational parameters. Some passengers had begun making phone calls, their voices tight with the universal anxiety of people who sensed danger but couldn't identify its source. United 1247, Denver Center. Runway 34L is cleared for your emergency approach. Emergency vehicles are positioned and ready. Confirm your estimated time to touchdown. Torres looked at Ghost, his question unspoken but clear. She closed her eyes briefly, calculating approach angles, energy dissipation rates, and landing distances using mental mathematics refined through years of aircraft carrier operations, where miscalculations measured in feet determined life or death outcomes. "Tell them 15 minutes, Ghost said, and request that they foam the runway. We're going to need every advantage available." What none of them said aloud was that their approach would likely involve landing speeds higher than normal, with reduced control authority and compromised braking systems. The margin for error had shrunk to tolerances that existed more in prayer than aerodynamic engineering. Ghost began explaining her approach strategy, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had learned to make impossible decisions under pressure. Torres found himself nodding, recognizing competence even when it arrived wrapped in methods his training had never covered. Outside the cockpit windows, Denver International Airport appeared on the horizon, its runways looking impossibly narrow from 37,000 feet. Somewhere below, emergency crews were taking positions along runway 34L, their equipment ready for scenarios ranging from successful emergency landings to catastrophic impact events that would require body recovery operations. The next 13 minutes would determine whether Ghost's reputation for bringing damaged aircraft home would extend to civilian aviation, or whether United Flight 1247 would become another statistics in accident investigation databases. Ghost's hands moved across the controls with surgical precision, each input calculated to extract maximum performance from compromised systems. She had learned this mathematics of survival in conditions where failure meant not just personal death, but the loss of multi-million-dollar aircraft and the disappointment of squadron commanders who had invested careers in training naval aviators. "Captain," Ghost said, her voice cutting through radio chatter and system warnings, "I need you to make an announcement to the passengers. Tell them we're executing an emergency landing, that they should assume crash positions on my command, but that our approach will be controlled and deliberate." Torres hesitated, recognizing that such announcements often created panic rather than compliance. Ghost read his hesitation and continued, "Sir, these passengers need to understand that their survival depends on following instructions precisely. Sugarcoating our situation won't help anyone if we need them to evacuate quickly after touchdown." The 737's engines developed an irregular harmonic that made Kim check her instruments twice, confirming what they all suspected. Their mechanical problems were cascading beyond hydraulic systems into propulsion reliability. Ghost adjusted their approach angle, compensating for reduced engine performance with techniques she had learned landing damaged aircraft on carrier decks that moved in three-dimensional space. Through the passenger windows, Denver's urban landscape spread below them like a detailed model, each building and street representing potential obstacles or emergency landing sites if their primary approach failed. Ghost had already identified 3 alternate crash sites, ranking them by probable survivor outcomes, a mental exercise that naval aviators practiced but rarely discussed with civilians. United 1247, Denver Tower. Wind conditions showing gusts up to 40 knots, variable direction. Advise if you require vectors to alternate airports with more favorable weather. Ghost keyed her mic. Denver Tower Ghost, United 1247, will take runway 34L regardless of wind conditions. Our aircraft systems won't tolerate extended flight time for weather shopping. Her use of her call sign slipped out naturally, a verbal habit developed through thousands of hours in military aviation, where individual identity merged with aircraft performance. Torres noticed but said nothing, recognizing that Ghost had shifted into operational mode where personal considerations disappeared behind mission requirements. The cabin had grown quieter, passengers sensing that their casual travel experience had transformed into something more serious. A businessman in first class reviewed his life insurance policy on his phone. A mother in row 18 held her sleeping infant closer, whispering prayers in Spanish. The retired mechanic in 12A watched Ghost through the partially open cockpit door, his experienced eyes recognizing competence in her economical movements. Ghost began her final approach calculations, working through energy management equations that accounted for compromised control authority, irregular engine performance, and landing distances that provided minimal margin for error. In her mind, she visualized the approach path, seeing it not as a gradual descent, but as a controlled fall that required precise timing to convert altitude into distance without exceeding their aircraft's structural limitations. 10 minutes to touchdown, she announced over the intercom. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency landing procedures. What she didn't announce was that their success depended on executing an approach technique that existed somewhere between standard commercial aviation practices and the controlled violence of carrier landings. The next 10 minutes would test whether naval aviation training could translate to civilian aircraft operations when failure meant explaining to families why their loved ones hadn't come home. The aircraft continued its descent toward Denver International, carrying the hopes and fears of people who had trusted commercial aviation's safety record, without considering that sometimes survival required skills learned in military environments most passengers never thought about. Ghost felt the aircraft's mechanical pulse through the control yoke, reading its remaining capabilities like a doctor taking a patient's vital signs. Every input, every adjustment, every decision now carried the weight of 218 lives and the reputation of a naval aviator who had never failed to bring her aircraft home. The runway grew larger in their windscreen, its concrete surface representing either salvation or catastrophe depending on the next 6 minutes of flying. Denver Tower's emergency coordinator, Sandra Martinez, watched United 1247's approach on radar while coordinating ground response teams positioned along runway 34L. 23 years of air traffic control experience had taught her to recognize normal aircraft behavior, and this Boeing 737's flight path showed irregularities that made her reach for direct phone lines to emergency services. All units, United 1247 beginning final approach. Aircraft showing signs of significant system degradation. Prepare for possible runway overrun or control surface failure on touchdown. Ghost listened to emergency coordination chatter while making final approach adjustments, her trained ears filtering operational information from background noise. The runway stretched ahead of them like a narrow concrete lifeline, its edges marked by emergency vehicles that represented both hope and acknowledgement of potential disaster. 5 minutes to touchdown, Ghost announced, her voice reaching throughout the cabin. Flight attendants, passengers to crash positions in 60 seconds. In the cabin, Santos and her crew moved with practiced efficiency, demonstrating proper crash positions while maintaining the calm professionalism that kept panic from spreading through confined spaces. Passengers complied with varying degrees of understanding, some grasping the severity of their situation, while others treated the exercise as routine precaution. The businessman in first class had stopped checking his phone and now sat with his head between his knees, following instructions with the focus of someone who had suddenly realized that his morning commute might determine whether he saw his family again. The mother in row 18 sang softly to her infant, her voice carrying a lullaby that masked her own fear. Ghost felt the aircraft respond to her control inputs with the sluggish reliability of damaged machinery pushed beyond design limitations. Each adjustment required compensation for systems that no longer provided predictable responses, forcing her to rely on tactile feedback and instinctive understanding of aerodynamic principles rather than instrument readings. 3 minutes, she called out, watching the runway grow larger while calculating their approach angle against available control authority. The mathematics were unforgiving. They would touch down faster and steeper than normal procedures recommended, with reduced ability to correct for wind gusts or unexpected control responses. Torres found himself gripping his armrest, recognizing that their survival now depended entirely on Ghost's ability to translate naval aviation training into commercial aircraft operations. Her hands moved across the controls with economical precision, each input demonstrating competence developed through years of landing on moving aircraft carriers in conditions that challenged the boundaries of controlled flight. United 1247, Denver Tower. Emergency vehicles report ready. You are cleared for immediate landing. Runway 34L, good luck. The simple phrase, good luck, carried weight that professional aviators rarely heard in routine operations, acknowledging that their approach had moved beyond standard procedures into territory where skill, training, and chance would determine outcomes. Ghost began her final descent, feeling the aircraft's damaged systems struggle to maintain stable flight characteristics as they approached touchdown velocities. Through the cockpit windows, the runway expanded to fill their entire field of vision, its surface marked by tire tracks from thousands of previous landings that had concluded successfully. 30 seconds, Ghost announced. Brace for impact. The choice of words was deliberate. Impact, rather than landing, acknowledged the reality of their situation while preparing passengers for an arrival that might involve more violence than they expected. In her peripheral vision, she saw Torres and Kim assume crash positions, their training overriding natural impulses to maintain visual contact with their approach path. The Boeing 737 crossed the runway threshold at 173 knots, 40 knots faster than normal landing speeds, its damaged systems providing barely adequate control authority as Ghost fought to keep their descent rate within survivable parameters. The concrete rushed toward them with the geometric certainty of physics that cared nothing for human hopes or fears. Ghost pulled back on the yoke, bleeding off excess airspeed while managing their descent rate with inputs so precise they seemed to merge human intention with mechanical response. The aircraft's main landing gear touched runway 34L with the controlled violence of a successful carrier landing, rubber screaming against concrete as Ghost deployed every braking system available to their compromised aircraft. The next 12 seconds would determine whether her reputation for bringing damaged aircraft home would extend to civilian operations, or whether United Flight 1247 would join the statistical minority of commercial aviation accidents that reminded travelers why they unconsciously held their breath during landings. The Boeing 737 hit Denver's runway 34L with the controlled violence that separated successful emergency landings from catastrophic ground impacts. Ghost felt the aircraft's landing gear absorb energies beyond their design specifications, the main struts compressing with mechanical precision, while she fought to maintain directional control through compromised braking systems. Rubber burned against concrete as the aircraft's tires struggled to dissipate kinetic energy that normal commercial landings never approached. Ghost's hands worked the controls with surgical precision, each input calculated to extract maximum braking performance from systems that provided inconsistent feedback. The runway markers flashed past their windows at speeds that made Torres grip his armrest until his knuckles turned white. "Reverse thrust, maximum power," Ghost called out, her voice cutting through the mechanical noise of an aircraft pushed beyond its operational envelope. The 737's engines roared in protest, their thrust reversers directing exhaust forward to help arrest their momentum, while structural components groaned under stresses that aviation engineers had calculated, but hoped never to encounter. Through the passenger windows, emergency vehicles raced alongside their decelerating aircraft, their crews prepared for scenarios ranging from successful emergency stops to post-crash fire suppression operations. Ghost could see firefighters tracking their progress, ready to deploy foam systems if engine temperatures exceeded safe parameters or if their braking systems failed completely. 8,000 feet of runway remaining, First Officer Kim announced, her voice tight with concentration as she monitored their decreasing ground speed against available stopping distance. The mathematics were brutal. They were bleeding off velocity at rates that approached but didn't exceed their safety margins, leaving no room for mechanical failure or pilot error. In the cabin, passengers remained in crash positions while feeling their bodies pressed forward against restraining systems as the aircraft's braking forces exceeded anything they had experienced during normal commercial operations. The mother in row 18 whispered prayers while holding her infant, her voice barely audible above the mechanical symphony of maximum braking performance. The businessman in first class had closed his eyes, his life insurance policy forgot as he focused on surviving the next 60 seconds. Ghost felt the aircraft's nose wheel touch down, immediately applying steering inputs to maintain runway centerline while their ground speed dropped through 100 knots. The concrete beneath them showed scorch marks from their tire contact, evidence of energy dissipation that pushed rubber compounds toward their failure points. 4,000 feet remaining, Kim announced, her voice betraying the first hints of hope as their deceleration continued within acceptable parameters. Ghost adjusted brake pressure with the delicate touch of someone who understood the difference between maximum performance and catastrophic system failure, walking the edge between stopping short of runway's end and losing control authority through over-application of available resources. The Boeing 737's ground speed decreased through 80 knots, 70, 60, as Ghost felt their momentum bleeding away through mechanical systems that had performed beyond their design specifications without failing. Emergency vehicles began changing their formation from crash response positioning to successful landing support, their crews recognizing that United 1247 would stop safely within runway boundaries. 50 knots, 2,000 feet remaining, Kim called out, her voice now carrying unmistakable relief. Ghost maintained brake pressure while preparing for taxi operations, her trained mind already transitioning from emergency procedures to post-landing safety protocols that would ensure passenger evacuation proceeded without additional complications. The aircraft rolled to a complete stop with 800 feet of runway remaining, their wheels finally at rest on concrete that had witnessed one of the most challenging commercial aviation emergency landings in Denver International's operational history. Ghost set the parking brake with hands that remained steady despite having just executed a landing that existed at the intersection of naval aviation training and commercial aircraft operation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have stopped safely on runway 34L, Torres announced over the intercom, his voice carrying the controlled emotion of a pilot who had just watched someone save his aircraft and everyone aboard it. Please remain seated while emergency crews conduct their safety inspection. Through the cockpit windows, Ghost watched firefighters approach their aircraft with thermal imaging equipment, verifying that their engines and braking systems had not exceeded safe temperature parameters during their maximum performance landing. The precision of their post-landing procedures demonstrated the professionalism that made commercial aviation statistically safer than driving to airports. Ghost unbuckled her harness and turned toward Tours, her expression carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed a mission that challenged the boundaries of her training and experience. "Captain," she said, her voice returning to conversational tones after the intense focus of emergency operations, "your aircraft performed exactly as advertised. Boeing builds solid machines." What she didn't say was that her hands were shaking slightly, the delayed stress response that naval aviators learn to manage after high-stakes operations concluded successfully. She had brought another damaged aircraft home, extending her perfect record to include civilian operations that her military training had never directly addressed. Outside their windows, passengers were beginning to stand and gather belongings, their casual conversations resuming as they processed the fact that their emergency landing had concluded without injury or loss of life. Most would never fully understand how close they had come to becoming aviation accident statistics, or how much their survival had depended on the presence of a naval aviator who happened to be sleeping in row 6, when her expertise became the difference between life and death. Emergency vehicles surrounded United 1247, while ground crews prepared mobile stairs for passenger evacuation. Ghost watched the coordinated response with professional appreciation, recognizing the same systematic approach to safety that made both military and commercial aviation possible. Her part of the emergency was complete, but the administrative aftermath would continue for months as federal investigators analyzed every aspect of their mechanical failures and emergency response. Tours extended his hand toward Ghost, a gesture that carried gratitude beyond what commercial aviation protocols typically required. She shook it briefly, her grip carrying the confident strength of someone who had learned to make life-or-death decisions under pressure and live with their consequences. "Commander," Tours said, "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been aboard today. Thank you for bringing us home." Ghost nodded, accepting his gratitude while already knowing that she would downplay her role in post-incident interviews and federal investigation statements. Naval aviators learned to focus on mission completion rather than personal recognition, a professional habit that translated well to civilian emergencies, where teamwork mattered more than individual heroics. Through the passenger windows, they could see news helicopters arriving to document the story of United 1247's emergency landing, their cameras ready to broadcast images that would remind viewers why they unconsciously trusted commercial aviation while secretly fearing mechanical failures at altitude. Ghost realized that her quiet travel day had become a public story, her naval aviation background about to receive attention she neither sought nor particularly welcomed. Passenger evacuation began with the systematic efficiency that flight crews practiced, but hoped never to use in actual emergencies. Santos and her team guided travelers toward exits with calm professionalism that masked their own relief at having survived an experience that would generate incident reports, federal investigations, and training updates throughout the commercial aviation industry. The businessman from first class paused at the cockpit door, his expression mixing gratitude with the shell-shocked look of someone who had just realized that routine travel could involve life-threatening emergencies resolved by strangers with specialized skills. He wanted to say something meaningful, but settled for a simple "thank you" that carried more weight than elaborate speeches might have conveyed. The mother from row 18 emerged from the aircraft carrying her infant, who had slept through most of their emergency landing, and now looked around with the cheerful curiosity of someone too young to understand that they had just survived an experience worth remembering. Her whispered prayers had been answered in the form of a naval aviator, whose training bridged military and civilian aviation when conventional solutions proved inadequate. Ghost gathered her carry-on luggage, preparing to transition from emergency responder back to civilian traveler, knowing that federal investigators would want detailed statements about aircraft performance, control responses, and decision-making processes that had resulted in successful emergency landing rather than accident statistics. Her involvement in United 1247's story was far from over, but her primary mission, bringing damaged aircraft and their occupants home safely, had been accomplished once again. As passengers filed past the cockpit toward waiting ground transportation, many looked toward Ghost with expressions mixing curiosity and gratitude. They had witnessed competence under pressure, watching someone translate specialized military training into civilian applications that saved lives through skills most people never thought about during routine travel. Torres began his post-flight procedures, documenting mechanical failures and emergency responses that would generate reports throughout Denver International's operational hierarchy. First Officer Kim assisted with shutdown checklists, while emergency crews completed their safety inspections, confirming that their aircraft could be safely towed to maintenance facilities for comprehensive investigation of the hydraulic system failures that had transformed routine flight into life-threatening emergency. Ghost stepped onto the mobile stairs leading from aircraft to ground, pausing briefly to look back at the Boeing 737 that had challenged her naval aviation training in ways that aircraft carrier operations never had. The machine sat motionless on Denver's concrete runway, its external appearance showing no obvious signs of the internal system failures that had brought them so close to disaster. Her reflection was interrupted by airport security personnel, who needed to coordinate with federal investigators already en route to begin preliminary examination of United 1247's mechanical failures and emergency response procedures. Ghost's role as civilian passenger was about to transform into that of key witness in aviation safety investigations that would influence training protocols and maintenance procedures throughout commercial airline operations. The story of United 1247's emergency landing would become part of aviation safety databases. But for Ghost, it represented another successful mission in a career built on bringing damaged aircraft home when conventional solutions proved inadequate. Her record remained perfect, extending from military operations into civilian aviation, where lives depended on skills learned in environments most passengers never considered during routine travel. Federal Aviation Administration investigators arrived at Denver International within 90 minutes of United 1247's emergency landing. Their team, including specialists in hydraulic system failures, emergency procedures, and human factors analysis, who would spend weeks reconstructing every decision that had prevented commercial aviation disaster. Ghost found herself in an airport conference room, providing detailed testimony about aircraft performance characteristics and control responses that had enabled their successful landing. Senior investigator Patricia Williams reviewed Ghost's naval aviation record while preparing interview questions that would help determine whether United 1247's emergency response represented exceptional individual performance or systemic deficiencies in commercial aviation emergency protocols. Her preliminary research revealed a career distinguished by successful recovery of damaged aircraft under conditions that challenged conventional training parameters. Commander Restrepo, Williams began, her voice carrying the professional neutrality required for federal investigations. Walk us through your assessment of the aircraft's condition when you entered the cockpit. Focus on specific system responses rather than general impressions. Ghost responded with the precise technical language learned through years of post-flight debriefings, where accuracy mattered more than dramatic storytelling. She described control surface responses, hydraulic pressure readings, and engine performance characteristics that painted a detailed picture of mechanical failures cascading through backup systems faster than standard emergency procedures could address. Her testimony revealed the systematic approach that naval aviators applied to emergency situations: rapid assessment of available resources, identification of critical failure points, development of unconventional solutions when standard procedures proved inadequate, and execution of plans that balanced acceptable risk against mission requirements. Federal investigators recognized competence that extended beyond individual skill into institutional training philosophy. Your approach technique differed significantly from commercial aviation standard practices, Williams observed. Explain the reasoning behind your decision to accept higher landing speeds rather than attempting to extend your approach for energy dissipation. Ghost's explanation demonstrated the mathematical precision that characterized naval aviation decision-making: calculation of control authority degradation rates, assessment of engine reliability under extended operational stress, evaluation of weather conditions that could compromise extended flight time, and risk analysis that favored controlled high-energy landing over potential loss of control during extended approach procedures. The investigation team's preliminary findings suggested that Ghost's naval aviation background had provided skills directly applicable to commercial aviation emergency situations that standard pilot training didn't fully address. Her experience with damaged aircraft operations, unconventional approach techniques, and high-stress decision-making had bridged gaps between military and civilian aviation, where lives depended on competence that existed beyond normal training parameters. Media coverage of United 1247's emergency landing focused on the dramatic narrative of passengers saved by unexpected expertise rather than the technical details that interested federal investigators. News reports described Ghost as a hero, while missing the systematic training and institutional philosophy that had prepared her for emergency situations that challenged conventional solutions. Ghost declined most interview requests, preferring to let federal investigators complete their analysis before discussing operational details that might influence ongoing safety assessments. Her reticence frustrated journalists seeking dramatic personal narratives, but reflected military habits of allowing official processes to proceed without interference from public relations considerations that could compromise technical accuracy. The passengers of United 1247 gradually returned to their normal routines, but many carried lasting appreciation for the stranger who had appeared when their lives depended on specialized skills they hadn't known existed aboard their aircraft. Some sent thank-you letters through Denver International's administrative offices, their messages mixing gratitude with newfound awareness of the professional competence that made commercial aviation possible. Captain Torres completed his statement to federal investigators while beginning the administrative process of returning to flight operations. His career, enhanced by successful emergency management that had resulted in 0 casualties, despite mechanical failures that challenged aircraft design limitations. His decision to seek military pilot assistance would influence future emergency protocols throughout commercial aviation. First Officer Kim's testimony corroborated technical details of their emergency response, while highlighting the collaborative decision-making that had enabled successful outcome despite system failures beyond their normal training parameters. Her professional development would benefit from exposure to naval aviation techniques that complemented commercial flight training. The Boeing 737 remained on Denver's runway, while maintenance specialists conducted preliminary examination of hydraulic system components that had failed during routine flight operations. Their initial findings suggested manufacturing defects rather than maintenance negligence, information that would influence safety directives affecting similar aircraft throughout commercial aviation fleets worldwide. Ghost's involvement in United 1247's story represented intersection of military and civilian aviation, where specialized training proved directly applicable to emergency situations that standard commercial protocols couldn't fully address. Her success demonstrated the value of diverse professional backgrounds in transportation systems, where passenger safety depended on competence that extended beyond conventional training boundaries. 3 weeks after United 1247's emergency landing, Ghost received notification from the Federal Aviation Administration that her actions had been officially recognized as contributing to successful emergency response that prevented potential loss of life during commercial aviation operations. The recognition represented acknowledgement that military aviation training provided skills directly applicable to civilian emergency situations. Congressional hearings on commercial aviation safety protocols included testimony about United 1247's emergency response, with federal legislators questioning whether standard pilot training adequately prepared flight crews for mechanical failures that exceeded conventional emergency procedures. Ghost's naval aviation background became a case study in cross-training benefits that could enhance passenger safety throughout commercial aviation operations. The National Transportation Safety Board's final report on United 1247's incident recommended enhanced emergency training that incorporated military aviation techniques for managing aircraft with compromised control systems. Their findings suggested that collaboration between commercial and military aviation communities could improve safety outcomes during emergency situations that challenged standard training parameters. Airlines began reviewing their emergency response protocols in light of United 1247's successful landing, with several carriers implementing enhanced training programs that exposed commercial pilots to unconventional approach techniques and high-stress decision-making scenarios adapted from military aviation operations. Ghost's expertise influenced industry-wide changes that would benefit future emergency situations. Ghost returned to her duties at Naval Air Station Oceana, her reputation enhanced by successful civilian aviation emergency response that demonstrated the applicability of naval aviation training beyond military operations. Her commanding officers noted the positive publicity that reflected well on Navy pilot training programs and their contribution to national transportation safety. The story of United 1247's emergency landing became part of aviation safety databases, training materials, and professional development programs that reminded pilots why continuous learning and cross-training enhanced their ability to respond to emergency situations that challenged conventional solutions. Ghost's name appeared in case studies that would influence pilot training for years to come. Passenger reunions with Ghost occurred sporadically over the following months, chance encounters in airports or military events, where grateful travelers recognized the woman who had saved their lives through skills they hadn't known existed aboard their aircraft. These meetings reinforced her understanding that military training served broader national purposes beyond defense operations. United Airlines implemented policy changes based on United 1247's emergency response, including procedures for identifying military pilots among passengers during emergency situations and protocols for integrating their expertise with commercial flight operations. Ghost's successful intervention influenced industry standards that would benefit future emergency situations. The Boeing 737 from United 1247 was eventually repaired and returned to service after comprehensive overhaul of hydraulic systems and installation of enhanced backup systems designed to prevent similar failures. The aircraft continued carrying passengers safely, its emergency landing becoming part of aviation history that reminded travelers of the professional competence that made commercial flight possible. Ghost's reflection on United 1247's emergency landing emphasized the importance of maintaining proficiency in fundamental flying skills that existed beyond specific aircraft types or operational environments. Her naval aviation training had proven applicable to civilian operations because both required systematic approaches to emergency decision-making and precision aircraft control under adverse conditions. The intersection of military and civilian aviation, demonstrated by United 1247's emergency landing, highlighted the broader value of professional military training in national transportation systems. Ghost's expertise represented investment in human capital that served multiple purposes beyond immediate defense requirements, contributing to overall national safety and transportation reliability. Years later, Ghost continued receiving occasional correspondence from United 1247's passengers, their messages serving as reminders that professional competence could influence lives in ways that extended far beyond immediate operational requirements. Her naval aviation career had touched civilian lives through emergency response that demonstrated the broader applications of military training. The legacy of United 1247's emergency landing lived on in aviation training programs, safety protocols, and industry standards that incorporated lessons learned from successful integration of military and commercial aviation expertise during emergency situations. Ghost's contribution represented the human dimension of aviation safety that made commercial travel possible through professional competence that passengers rarely considered during routine operations. Her story became part of naval aviation tradition, demonstrating that military training served national purposes beyond defense operations by providing skills applicable to civilian emergency situations, where lives depended on competence that existed at the intersection of professional preparation and situational requirement. Ghost had brought another aircraft home safely, her mission complete.